2 obese girls were sold to a mountain man as a joke, while the whole town laughed. They thought it was cruel entertainment. But what happened next silenced every voice in Elk Creek Crossing. When the rugged stranger laid down 2 silver coins, no one guessed he wasn't buying servants. He was rescuing souls. High in the frozen mountains, the laughter of the town fades, replaced by the crackle of a fire and the sound of hymns whispered through tears. But word travels fast in the West. The sheriff calls it kidnapping. The men who mocked them want him jailed. And when the snow melts, truth and mercy will face off in the dusty courtroom of a town that's forgotten both. He saved them once, but can he save them again when the law turns against him? And when the world calls them worthless? Who dares to decide what a soul is really worth? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The icy wind howled through the gaps in the Grange Hall's wooden walls as Martha Hale pulled her thin shawl tighter. Her younger sister Catalina huddled close, both of them shivering more from fear than cold. The familiar jeers and whispers followed them as rough hands pushed them toward the auction platform. "Step right up, folks," the mine foreman bellowed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Got ourselves a special treat today. 2 for the price of 1. His words brought another wave of cruel laughter. Martha's cheeks burned as she stared at her worn boots. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, reminding her of just how visible they were to everyone. Since the fever had taken their parents last spring, she and Catalina had endured endless mockery about their size. But this, being put up for auction like cattle, felt like a new low. Catalina's hand found hers, squeezing tight. At 19, her sister still carried a spark of hope in her round face that Martha wished she could protect. Even now, Martha noticed how Catalina's fingers twitched, likely itching for her pencils and sketch paper, her way of finding beauty in even the darkest moments. "Look at the size of 'em," someone shouted from the crowd. "Could plow a whole field with those 2. The mine foreman, red-faced and grinning, played to his audience. "Who will start the bidding? These fine draft animals need a good home." He emphasized the words with an exaggerated wink that sent another ripple of laughter through the hall. Martha's vision blurred with unshed tears. At 24, she'd learned to weather insults about her plain face and strong build, but being stripped of dignity in front of the whole town threatened to break her carefully maintained composure. She'd worked honest jobs, cooking at the ranch, helping with harvests, but after the last place let them go, no one would hire the giant sisters. The silence that followed the foreman's call for bids stretched painfully. Martha could hear every creak of the wooden chairs, every whispered joke, every snicker. The snow continued its relentless dance outside the windows, matching the cold settling in her heart. Then a quiet voice cut through the mockery. $2 silver. The crowd parted, revealing a broad-shouldered man standing near the back. Martha recognized Luis Red, the mountain man who sometimes came to town for supplies. His grizzled hair and slight limp from an old war wound made him distinctive, though he rarely spoke to anyone. Fresh laughter erupted, even louder than before. "Red's looking to start his own circus," someone called out. Another voice added, "Gonna need a bigger cabin." The mine foreman wiped tears of mirth from his eyes. "Now, Luis, you sure about this? That's good silver you're offering for our little joke here." Luis didn't respond to the taunts. He limped forward, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The crowd fell silent as he approached, perhaps sensing something in his steady gaze that suggested this was no joke to him. He laid $2 silver on the platform, the metal catching the dim lamplight. Martha held her breath. She'd seen Luis at a distance, knew he lived alone up in the mountains where he trapped, and occasionally did blacksmith work for the scattered homesteads. Some said he'd been a Union soldier before coming west. Others whispered he was touched in the head after losing his wife. But standing closer now, she saw nothing but clarity in his eyes. "Come along, ladies," Luis said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to fill the sudden silence of the hall. No mockery, no judgment, just 3 simple words that somehow held more dignity than Martha had felt in months. Catalina moved first, her step light despite her size, artist's soul winning over fear. Martha followed, her practical nature already wondering what sort of work he'd expect, what conditions they'd face. Better to face the known than stay here for more humiliation. The hall had grown so quiet they could hear the winds moan through the eaves. No one spoke as Luis held the door open for them, treating them with a courtesy that seemed to rebuke every laugh, every cruel word spoken that day. The snow whirled around them as they stepped outside, the flurries catching in Martha's dark hair. She expected Luis to lead them to a wagon, but there was only a single patient horse waiting, steam rising from its nostrils. "It's a fair piece to my cabin," Luis said, his voice still gentle. "But I've got a warm fire going and soup on the stove. You ladies handy with cooking?" Martha nodded, finding her voice. "I was cook at the Murphy Ranch until—" She trailed off, not wanting to relive that dismissal. "Good." Luis adjusted his coat against the wind. "Been living on my own cooking too long. Reckon it's time for some proper meals." He paused, looking at Catalina. "Saw you drawing on the church steps last Sunday. Got some paper and pencils at home, if you've a mind to use them." Catalina's face lit up, then dimmed with suspicion. Why did you buy us, Mr. Red?" Luis was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. "Because no child of God should be treated like you were in there." He shifted his weight off his bad leg. "I've got a cabin needs keeping, gardens need tending come spring, and plenty of honest work for willing hands. But mostly—" He looked at each sister in turn, his eyes serious. "Mostly because I reckon we all need family sometimes, even if we have to piece it together ourselves." Martha felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. She glanced at Catalina and saw the same feeling reflected there. "Now then," Luis said, leading his horse forward. "Let's get home before this storm worsens. We'll take turns riding. No sense in all of us getting soaked through." As they left the Grange Hall behind, Martha heard the conversations resume inside, but they seemed muted now, less important. The snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks as they made their way toward the mountains, toward whatever future lay ahead, with this quiet man who had seen their worth when no one else would. The wind dropped briefly, and Martha caught Luis humming what sounded like an old hymn. His voice was soft but clear, carrying promise of shelter, of dignity restored, of a chance to begin again. She adjusted her shawl, squared her shoulders, and walked on, leaving the cruel laughter of Elk Creek Crossing behind with every step. The harsh wind howled across the snow-covered valley as Luis's wagon creaked through the deepening drifts. Martha and Catalina huddled close together in the back, their thin shawls offering little protection against the biting cold. The wooden bed of the wagon rattled beneath them with each bump and dip in the trail. Luis glanced back from his perch on the driver's seat, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind. Without a word, he shrugged off his old army coat, the blue fabric faded but still thick, and passed it back to them. "But sir, you'll freeze," Martha protested, even as her fingers clutched the heavy wool. "Been through worse," Luis said simply, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Had colder nights during the war, He turned his attention back to the reins, guiding the horse carefully around a fallen branch. Martha spread the coat over both of them, and Catalina pressed closer, her teeth finally stopping their chattering. The coat carried the scent of wood smoke and pine, with an underlying hint of leather that spoke of years of wear. The wagon climbed steadily higher into the pine-covered ridges. Snow gathered thick on the branches overhead, occasionally dropping in soft clumps when the wind shook the trees. The sisters watched as the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the growing darkness and swirling snow. "What do you suppose he wants with us?" Catalina whispered in Spanish, her voice trembling. "No one's ever been kind without wanting something in return." Martha squeezed her sister's hand, but didn't answer. She'd been wondering the same thing. The mountain man's quiet demeanor and gentle actions confused her. They didn't match the cruel world she'd come to know since their parents' death. After what felt like hours, a shape emerged from the growing darkness. A cabin nestled against the hillside, sturdy logs chinked with clay and moss. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. A small barn stood nearby, its door secured against the storm. Luis pulled the wagon under a rough-built shelter and helped them down, his movements careful but respectful. No lingering touches, no suggestive looks. "Let me see to the horse," he said. "Go on inside and warm yourselves. Fire should still be burning." Martha hesitated, but the wind cut through her dress like knives, pushing her toward the cabin door. Inside, they found a single room, rough-hewn but clean. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A table with 3 chairs stood to one side, while a narrow bed occupied the far corner. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few books sat on a crude shelf. Catalina gripped Martha's arm. "There's only one bed," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Before Martha could respond, Luis entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He moved to the fire, adding logs from the stack beside the hearth. The flames leapt higher, filling the cabin with welcome warmth and light. "Got some venison stew staying warm," he said, moving to the pot hanging near the fire. "Been simmering since morning." He took down 3 bowls from a shelf and filled them without ceremony. The sisters remained standing, uncertain, as Luis placed the bowls on the table. The rich smell of the stew made Martha's stomach growl. They hadn't eaten since early morning, but anxiety kept her rooted in place. Luis seemed to sense their unease. He straightened slowly, keeping his distance. "Reckon we should clear something up," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're safe here. I'll be sleeping by the hearth. That bed's yours." He gestured to the corner. "Got extra blankets in the chest there." Martha felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but confusion replaced it. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why would you help us?" Luis took his time answering, settling into one of the chairs with a slight wince. His bad leg must have been paining him after the long drive. "Been alone up here a long time," he finally said. "Sometimes a man forgets he's human until he sees others being treated like they ain't." He nodded toward the table. "Food's getting cold." Slowly the sisters took their seats. The wooden chairs creaked beneath them. They were used to such sounds, to furniture protesting their weight, but Luis didn't seem to notice or care. The stew was rich with hoimbas, tender meat and root vegetables, better than anything they'd eaten in months. Still, Martha couldn't bring herself to take the first bite. Instead, she folded her hands and bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind's moaning and the cabin's settling creaks. "We thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and—" She paused, glancing at their quiet host. for unexpected kindness. Amen. Amen, Luis echoed softly, and even Catalina murmured the word. They ate in silence, broken only by the snap of the fire and the storm's fury outside. Martha watched as Luis focused on his food, not staring at them or making demands. It was so different from what she'd expected, from what experience had taught her to expect, that she hardly knew what to think. When the bowls were empty, Luis rose stiffly. "Got some things to check in the barn before the night gets worse," he said. "Make yourselves comfortable. There's water in the bucket if you want tea." He pulled on his coat, still warm from their bodies, and disappeared into the night. As soon as the door closed, Catalina burst into tears. "I was so scared," she confessed in Spanish, clutching Martha's hand. "When they put us up there, when everyone was laughing, and then when he bought us, I thought—" "I know," Martha soothed, drawing her sister close. "I know, but maybe—" She looked around the simple cabin, at the well-swept floor and organized shelves, at the extra chairs that suggested Luis had been prepared for company, or perhaps hoping for it. "Maybe sometimes people can surprise us." They heard Luis moving around in the barn, the sound muffled by the storm. The cabin creaked and settled around them, but it felt less threatening now. The fire's warmth had penetrated their bones, and the filling meal sat comfortably in their stomachs. Martha stood and began clearing the bowls, falling into familiar patterns of household work. It gave her hands something to do, while her mind tried to make sense of their situation. A man who bought them at auction, but asked nothing in return. A solitary mountain dweller who had extra chairs at his table. A stranger who gave them his coat and his bed without hesitation. When Luis returned, stamping snow from his boots, he nodded approvingly at the cleaned bowls drying near the fire. "Much obliged," he said simply. "Been a while since anyone's done that for me." He gathered some blankets and arranged them near the hearth, then added another log to the fire. "There's a wash basin behind that screen if you want to clean up," he told them, pointing to a corner. "I'll step out again while you get settled." After he left, Martha and Catalina changed into their night dresses, the only other clothes they owned, and climbed into the bed. The straw tick was fresh, and the blankets clean, if well worn. They lay close together, as they had since childhood, listening to the wind howl outside. When Luis returned, he simply nodded to them and settled onto his blankets near the fire. "Sleep well," he said, and that was all. Martha lay awake for a long time, watching the firelight play on the ceiling. Beside her, Catalina's breathing had already settled into the rhythm of sleep. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind buffeted its walls, but the sound was somehow comforting now, like the building itself was protecting them from the storm outside. From his place by the fire, Luis began to snore softly, the sound mixing with the pop and crackle of burning wood. Martha felt her own eyes growing heavy, the events of the day catching up with her. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer, not of desperate pleading as she'd grown used to, but of simple gratitude for this unexpected shelter in the storm. The first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-rimmed windows, painting delicate patterns on the cabin's wooden floor. Martha stirred beneath the heavy quilts, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar creaking of timber walls and the sharp scent of pine. Then yesterday's events rushed back: the auction, the cruel laughter, and the quiet mountain man who had brought them here. A steady thunk-thunk sound drew her attention to the window. Through the crystalline frost patterns, she could make out Luis's broad figure in the yard, methodically splitting logs. A large brown and white dog sat nearby, alert and watchful. The morning sun caught the axe blade as it rose and fell, sending brief flashes of light across the snow. The rich aroma of coffee and bacon drifted from the cook stove, making her stomach growl. Beside her, Catalina stirred and blinked sleepily. "Donde estamos?" Catalina mumbled, then remembered. "Oh. It's all right," Martha whispered, squeezing her sister's hand. "We're safe." The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them, hadn't even known she believed them until that moment. But something about the quiet strength of their host, the simple cleanliness of his home, and the careful distance he maintained, told her it was true. They dressed quickly in their wrinkled clothes from yesterday, taking turns behind the screen to wash their faces in the basin of fresh water Luis must have brought in that morning. Martha smoothed their bed, tucking the quilts with careful precision. The door opened, bringing a rush of crisp mountain air. Luis stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door. The dog, Martha hadn't noticed him last night, trotted in behind him, shaking off snow before settling near the stove. "Morning," Luis said, nodding to them. "That's Scout. He won't bother you none." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor in acknowledgement. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some," he continued, moving to the stove where a pot of bacon sizzled. "Bread's fresh, too. Baked it yesterday." Martha stepped forward. "I can help with that, sir." Luis shook his head. "Your guests. Sit." He gestured to the table where 3 plates waited. "And it's just Luis. No sir needed up here in the mountains." They sat, watching as he efficiently served up thick slices of bacon, crusty bread, and eggs from his small flock of chickens. The coffee was strong and hot, softened by fresh cream that spoke of a cow in the barn they hadn't seen last night. As they ate, Luis seemed to be considering something. Finally, he spoke. "Been thinking. Winter's setting in hard. Roads'll be near impassable soon. Reckon you'll need to stay here till spring at least." He paused, gauging their reaction. "If you're willing, could use some help with things. Cooking, mending, tending the animals. Pay you fair wages." Martha's hand tightened on her fork. It was more than they could have hoped for. Honest work, a safe place to stay. But experience had taught her to be wary of such offers. Luis seemed to read her thoughts. "Your room's yours. No strings attached. You want to leave when the weather breaks, I'll help you get wherever you're heading. But," he hesitated, "gets lonely up here. Wouldn't mind some company through the winter." Catalina looked at Martha, hope shining in her eyes. Martha nodded slowly. "We'd be grateful for the work." "Good." Luis sipped his coffee. "Mind if I ask? Can either of you read?" Martha sat a little straighter. "I can. Mama taught me before she passed. I've been teaching Catalina some, but—" She trailed off, remembering the endless days of work that had left little time for lessons. "I like to draw," Catalina offered softly, then blushed and looked down at her plate. Something flickered across Luis's weathered face. Pain? Memory? He rose and went to a trunk in the corner, returning with a leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth with handling, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges. "Used to belong to my Sarah," he said quietly, holding it out to Catalina. "She liked to sketch the mountains, the wildlife. Haven't opened it since." He cleared his throat. "Would do these pages good to have someone using them again." Catalina took the sketchbook with trembling hands, carefully opening it to reveal delicate drawings of wildflowers, birds, and mountain vistas. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Luis nodded. She would have wanted it used, not sitting in a trunk gathering dust. Martha watched her sister's eyes fill with tears as she cradled the book. It was more than just paper and leather. It was trust, acceptance, the first real kindness they'd known since their parents died. The day passed in a blur of domestic activity. Luis showed them the barn with its cow and chickens, the smokehouse where strips of venison hung drying, the root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables. Everything was organized with military precision, speaking of his years as a soldier. That evening, after a simple but filling supper, Luis cleared his throat. "Got a habit?" he said, almost apologetically. "Like to say thanks before turning in. You're welcome to join or not." Before they could respond, he bowed his head. His prayer wasn't the formal church language Martha remembered from their childhood. Instead, it was rough and honest, like a man talking to an old friend. "Lord, you know I ain't much for fancy words," he began, "but I'm grateful for this day, for food on the table and a warm fire, for Scout's warning when that bear got too close to the chickens." He paused. "And Lord, thank you for sending these girls. Been a while since this cabin heard women's voices. Help me be worthy of their trust." Martha and Catalina exchanged glances across the table. This wasn't the godless hermit the townspeople whispered about. This was a man who feared his creator more than the opinions of men, who saw divine purpose even in a cruel auction on a snowy day. "Amen," Martha whispered, and Catalina echoed her. Scout thumped his tail against the floor, as if adding his own agreement to the prayer. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to the rising moon. But inside the cabin, warmth and peace settled over them like a familiar quilt, wrapping them in the knowledge that they had found not just shelter, but perhaps something closer to home. The storm that began the night before strengthened into a relentless blizzard. For 3 days, snow fell in thick curtains, piling against the cabin walls until the windows showed nothing but white. Inside, Luis, Martha, and Catalina settled into an unexpected rhythm of survival. "Best learn quick," Luis said on that first morning, pulling on his heavy coat. "Winter up here ain't forgiving." He led them to the woodpile, now nearly buried in snow. "Wood's life," he explained, demonstrating how to judge a log's weight, how to stack their arms to carry the maximum load without strain. Martha took to it naturally, her strong arms managing loads that made Luis nod in approval. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip on a particularly large piece. "Just so," Luis answered, his usual quiet voice carrying a note of respect. "You got a knack for it." Catalina struggled with the heavier logs, but showed surprising agility at gathering kindling. Her smaller hands could reach into tight spaces between the stacked wood, retrieving the precious dry splinters that would start their morning fires. When the wind grew too fierce for woodcutting, Luis brought out his collection of wire snares. At the rough-hewn table, he taught them the art of rabbit trapping, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate as he demonstrated proper knots. "Too loose, they slip free," he explained, watching Catalina's careful attempts. "Too tight, wire might snap in the cold." His patience seemed endless as they practiced, the lamplight casting long shadows across the cabin floor. During these indoor days, stories emerged like spring water from winter ground. The sisters spoke of their parents, good people who had worked the valley farms until fever took them both in one cruel week. Martha's voice grew thick as she described how they had tried to maintain their parents' small homestead afterward. "Bank took it all," she said, her hands busy with a snare. "Said 2 girls couldn't manage the payments. Turned us out last month." Luis listened quietly, his weathered face showing understanding rather than pity. When the silence grew heavy, he shared his own tales of loss. He spoke of the war, of the thunder of cannons that had stolen half his hearing. "That's why I seem to ignore folks sometimes," he admitted one evening, stoking the fire. "Ain't rudeness, just can't always hear proper, especially on my left side." He told them about Sarah, his wife, who had died bringing their son into the world, the son who had lived only long enough to draw one breath. The pain in his voice was old, but still raw, like a wound that had healed wrong. "That's when I came up here," he said, Scout's head resting on his knee. "Reckoned the mountains might have answers that people couldn't give." The fourth morning dawned clear, but brutal with cold. They woke to strange, groaning sounds from the barn. "Roof's struggling," Luis said grimly after checking outside. "Too much snow up there. Need to clear it before it caves." Martha was already pulling on her boots. "I'll help." "Catalina, keep the fire strong," Luis instructed. "We'll need the warmth when we're done." Outside, the snow had drifted higher than Martha's waist. She followed Luis's path to the barn, where he was already assembling long-handled rakes from his tool shed. The barn roof sagged visibly, wood creaking under the weight of feet of packed snow. "Careful now," Luis cautioned, showing Martha how to brace herself on the ladder. "Pull steady, not sharp. Let the rake do the work." They worked in companionable silence, their breath frosting in the crystal air. The task was harder than it looked. The snow had partially melted and refrozen, forming stubborn layers that resisted the rakes. Martha's arms ached, but she matched Luis's pace, determined to prove her worth. A particularly stubborn section finally broke free, sliding down with unexpected speed. Martha lost her balance, windmilling briefly before strong hands steadied her. "Whoa there," Luis chuckled, his usually serious face breaking into a surprised smile. "Though I admit, that snow needed a good talking to." Martha found herself laughing, too, at the absurdity of their position, at the snow now covering them both, at the simple joy of working alongside someone who treated her with respect. Luis's laugh was rusty, as if long unused but genuine. They finished the job as the sun reached its peak, their faces red with cold and exertion. Inside, Catalina had hot coffee waiting and soup bubbling on the stove. Her quick eyes took in their snow-covered clothes and lingering smiles. That evening, while Martha and Luis played checkers by the fire, Catalina sat quietly with Sarah's sketchbook. Her pencil moved, swiftly across the paper, capturing the scene before her. The way Luis leaned forward to consider his move, how Martha's face showed fierce concentration, Scout dozing between them. When she finished, she studied her work with critical eyes. Previous pages showed single figures: Luis chopping wood, Martha kneading bread, the mountain peaks at sunset. But this drawing was different. It showed 3 people and a dog, arranged around the hearth like they had always belonged there. "May I see?" Luis asked, noticing her contemplation. Catalina hesitated only a moment before passing him the sketchbook. He looked at it for a long time, his rough finger tracing the lines gently. "You've got your mama's gift," Martha said softly, looking over his shoulder. "She always said art shows truth plainer than words." Luis nodded, still studying the drawing. "Reckon she was right about that." He handed the book back carefully. "Thank you, Catalina. Been a while since I saw this cabin the way it ought to be, with life in it." Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the mountain night still and sharp with stars. Inside, the fire popped and crackled, casting warm light over the 3 figures that no longer seemed like strangers thrown together by chance, but something closer to family. Martha looked around the cabin, at Luis teaching Scout a new trick, at Catalina adding details to her drawing, at the wooden walls that now felt more like shelter than prison. For the first time since their parents' death, she felt the knot of worry in her chest begin to loosen. They had come here as refugees from cruelty, but something else was taking root. Something built of shared work, of quiet understanding, of laughter surprised out of sorrow. Like the hardy plants that bloomed in mountain meadows, it was a tender thing yet, but growing stronger every day. A week of peaceful routine had settled over the mountain cabin. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the peaks gleam like polished silver. Luis pulled on his heavy coat and checked his supply lists twice, knowing the ride to town would take most of the day. "Need anything special?" he asked, as Martha handed him a package of trail biscuits she'd baked. "Just the usual flour and such," she replied, adjusting his scarf with sisterly concern. "And maybe some more lamp oil? Catalina's been drawing late into the evenings." Luis nodded, a small smile touching his weathered face. "Reckon we can manage that." He turned to where Catalina sat at the table, already sketching the morning light on fresh snow. "Keep an eye on things here, both of you. Scout'll bark if anyone comes near." The sisters watched from the doorway as Luis's wagon disappeared down the snowy track. Martha tried to ignore the worry gnawing at her stomach. They hadn't seen another soul since that night at the auction, but she knew town gossip had a way of festering like an untreated wound. The ride to Elk Creek Crossing took 3 hours, the wagon wheels crunching through crusty snow. Luis kept his mind on practical matters: feed for the horses, ammunition for hunting, the endless small needs that mountain life required. But as he approached the town's outskirts, tension crept into his shoulders. The general store's bell jangled as he entered. Old Man Wilson barely looked up from his ledger, though Luis noticed how the shopkeeper's eyes followed him as he gathered his supplies. He was checking the quality of a flour sack when voices drifted in from the loading dock out back. "Heard tell Red's got himself quite the arrangement up there," a man's voice carried through the thin walls. "Bought himself a pair of mountain cows at that charity auction. Real generous of him, wasn't it, boys?" Coarse laughter followed. Luis recognized the voice, belonging to one of the mine foreman's cronies. He continued examining the flour, his face impassive, though his hands tightened on the rough burlap. "Wonder what kind of charity work they're doing for him?" another voice added, triggering more ugly laughter. Luis set the flour sack in his cart with deliberate care. He'd learned in the war that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when they'd only bring trouble to those he sought to protect. He added lamp oil, coffee, and other necessities to his purchases, keeping his expression neutral as Wilson tallied the items. The store's back door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and 3 men from the mine. They fell silent when they saw Luis, exchanging knowing smirks. He paid his bill without acknowledging them, though his left hand, the one that still carried war scars, twitched slightly. As he loaded his wagon, a familiar figure approached. Sheriff Amos Greeley. The lawman's badge caught the winter sunlight, and his face wore its usual mask of weary official concern. "Mr. Red," Greeley said, touching the brim of his hat. "Got a moment?" Luis secured the last crate before turning. "Sheriff." Greeley glanced up and down the street before continuing in a lower voice. "That auction last month, it's causing some talk. Mine foreman's concerned about how it might look to his eastern investors. Wants the whole thing forgotten." "Nothing to forget," Luis replied evenly. "Was a public event, everything legal and proper." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Luis, I'm trying to help here. Those girls, their presence in your cabin, it don't look right. People are talking. The foreman's got influence with the territorial judge. Could make trouble if he's minded to." Luis checked his wagon's brake, his movements unhurried. "The Lord sees what's right, Sheriff. Men's opinions don't change that." "The Lord don't issue arrest warrants," Greeley countered, though his voice held more resignation than threat. "Just keep those girls close to your property for a while. Let things cool down. And if anyone official comes asking questions..." He left the warning unfinished. "Much obliged for the advice," Luis said quietly. He climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. "Good day, Sheriff." The ride home seemed longer, though the horses knew the way. Luis's mind churned with the morning's events, weighing options, considering threats. The sisters had nowhere else to go. That was plain enough. And he'd sworn before God to provide them shelter. Still, he hadn't anticipated the town's malice following them up the mountain. Dusk was falling when he finally pulled up to the cabin. Martha and Catalina rushed out to help unload, their faces bright with welcome. The sight eased something in his chest. This wasn't just charity anymore, but family. Inside, as they stored supplies and prepared supper, Luis chose his words carefully. "Need to talk about something," he began, watching Martha knead dough for fresh bread. "Had some words with the sheriff today?" The sisters stilled their work, exchanging glances. Catalina's hands trembled slightly as she set down her sketching pencil. "Seems there's folk in town still talking about that auction," Luis continued. "Nothing for you to fret over, but we need to be careful for a spell. Best if you both stay close to the cabin, at least until spring thaw brings new gossip for them to chew on." Martha's fingers worked the dough with increased vigor, her face flushed. "It's our fault," she said quietly. "Bringing trouble to your door after all your kindness." "No," Luis's voice was firm. "Ain't your fault at all. It's men's pride and meanness causing the trouble. You've done nothing wrong." "But the sheriff," Catalina began. "Sheriff's just doing what he always does, trying to keep peace by bending to whoever shouts loudest." Luis sat at the table, gesturing for them to join him. "Listen now, both of you. What happened that night at the auction wasn't right. Not the way they treated you, not the laughing, none of it. But God sometimes works in ways we don't expect. He brought us together, made us a family of sorts. Don't you go taking blame for other folks' sin." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Still, if they cause problems for you—" "Let me worry about that," Luis interrupted gently. "You girls focus on keeping warm and safe. Spring'll come soon enough, and with it new possibilities. For now, we just need to be patient and trust in the Lord's timing." That evening, after Luis had gone to check the animals one last time, Martha knelt beside her bed. The cabin was quiet except for Catalina's soft breathing and the crackle of the banked fire. "Lord," she whispered, her hands clasped tight, "please don't let him regret helping us. He's a good man, better than most who call themselves Christian. Don't let our presence bring him harm." She thought of the cruel laughter Luis must have endured in town, the threats barely veiled in the sheriff's warning. Her heart ached with guilt, yet she couldn't help feeling grateful, too. Grateful for this rough cabin that had become home, for Luis's quiet strength, for the chance to be part of something like family again. Through the window, she could see Luis's figure moving in the barn, lantern light casting his shadow huge against the wooden walls. Such a solitary man, who'd opened his home and heart to two strangers. Martha added one more whispered plea to her prayer, that God would protect him from the storm she feared was gathering. The lantern light winked out as Luis finished his chores. Martha heard his familiar limping step on the porch, then the soft greeting he always gave Scout before coming inside. Whatever trouble lay ahead, she realized, they would face it together. That thought gave her comfort as she finally rose from her knees and prepared for sleep. The blizzard struck without warning. One moment, the mountain air held only its usual winter chill. The next, fierce winds howled down from the peaks, driving walls of snow before them. Luis had seen such storms before, but the ferocity of this one made even his weathered face grow grave. "Martha, help me with the barn doors," he called over the rising wind. Together they fought against the gusts to secure the heavy wooden doors, making sure the livestock would stay warm. Scout huddled close to Luis's legs, whining at the storm's fury. Inside the cabin, Catalina had already stoked the fire and hung thick quilts over the windows to block drafts. The wind found every crack in the log walls, whistling through like ghost voices. Outside, Tree branches cracked under the weight of gathering ice. "Might last 3-4 days," Luis said, stamping snow from his boots. "Maybe longer." He surveyed their supplies with a critical eye. "We'll need to be careful with the firewood. Can't cut more until it passes." Martha nodded, already counting portions in her mind. "I'll stretch the flour with more water in the bread. We've got dried beef and those preserved peaches from autumn." The first day passed slowly, marked by the endless moan of wind. They kept the fire small, huddling close to share its warmth. Catalina sketched by lamplight while Martha darned socks. Luis told them stories of other storms he'd weathered, his quiet voice nearly lost in the blizzard's roar. On the second day, Catalina began to cough. By nightfall, her face was flushed with fever, her eyes too bright. Martha pressed a cool cloth to her sister's forehead, trying to hide her worry. "Just a cold," Catalina whispered, but her voice rasped painfully. Luis disappeared into the lean-to where he kept his supplies, returning with a wooden box worn smooth with age. Inside lay carefully labeled packets of dried herbs and roots. His hands, so large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness as he measured portions into a tin cup. "My Rebecca," he said softly. "She knew about healing. Taught me some before—" He didn't finish, but Martha understood. It was the first time he'd spoken his late wife's name. Through the long night, they took turns tending Catalina. The storm raged outside while inside, the battle was against fever. Luis steeped herbs in hot water, the bitter smell mixing with wood smoke. He helped Martha prop Catalina up to sip the medicine, supporting her sister's shoulders with careful strength. Martha woke sometime past midnight, worry having allowed only fitful sleep. In the fire's dim light, she saw Luis kneeling beside Catalina's bed. His head was bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. His hand, rough with scars and work, held her sister's smaller one with infinite tenderness. Martha closed her eyes quickly against sudden tears, feeling she'd witnessed something sacred. The fever broke on the third day, but the storm showed no sign of weakening. They were down to their last armload of indoor firewood. Luis had to dig through deep snow to reach the woodpile, returning with clothes frozen stiff and fingers blue with cold. "You've hardly slept," Martha said, watching him add precious logs to their fire. "Sleep can wait," he replied, but his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. He'd been up for 2 days straight, tending Catalina, keeping the fire fed, checking on the animals. When Catalina finally fell into natural sleep, her breathing easy at last, Luis sat heavily in his chair by the fire. Within moments, his chin dropped to his chest. Martha quietly covered him with a quilt, noting how the firelight showed new lines of worry on his weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered, though he couldn't hear. "For everything." The storm began to ease on the 4th day. Catalina was weak but recovering, propped up in bed with Luis's old sketchbook. Martha noticed Luis's sleeve was torn, probably from fighting through the snow to the woodpile. While he slept in his chair, she took out her sewing basket. The cabin was peaceful now. Wind still whistled outside, but softer, like it had spent its fury. Catalina's pencil scratched quietly as she drew. Martha's needle flashed in the firelight as she mended the rough wool of Luis's sleeve. "Look," Catalina whispered, turning her sketchbook. On the page, she'd captured Luis as he slept, head bowed, hands folded, the quilt Martha had covered him with draped across his shoulders. Somehow she'd caught not just his likeness, but his essence, the quiet strength, the gentle spirit behind his weathered exterior. Martha touched the drawing lightly. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Just as he is." Catalina smiled, still pale, but with her old sparkle returning. "He saved my life, didn't he?" "He did more than that," Martha replied, continuing her careful stitches. "He gave us a home, a family." Both sisters looked at the sleeping man who had become so dear to them. The storm that had threatened to destroy had instead bound them closer, proving the strength of the bonds between them. Outside, the wind gradually died away to silence, and the first weak sunlight began to filter through the snow-covered windows. Luis stirred slightly in his sleep, and Martha adjusted the quilt around his shoulders. There would be work ahead, paths to clear, wood piles to rebuild, animals to tend. But for now, in this moment of quiet after the storm, she simply gave thanks. Thanks for survival, for healing, and most of all, for the love that had grown between three lonely souls who had found each other in the heart of winter. The first signs of spring came softly to the mountain. Icicles dripped from the eaves, their steady patter marking time like nature's metronome. Patches of dark earth emerged from beneath the melting snow, and the air carried hints of awakening life. Luis stood at the cabin door one morning, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. The familiar weight of an old leather-bound Bible rested in his calloused hands. He'd been carrying it with him all morning, as if gathering courage for something. Martha was already up, her strong arms kneading bread dough at the wooden table. Catalina sat nearby, sketching the play of morning light through the frost-edged windows. The quiet domesticity of the scene made Luis's throat tighten with memories. "Martha," he said softly, his voice rougher than usual. "Might I show you something?" She wiped flour from her hands and came to join him by the hearth. Luis opened the Bible carefully, its well-worn pages falling open to a familiar spot. There, pressed between the pages of Psalms, lay a dried flower, a mountain columbine, its delicate purple petals preserved by time. "This was Maria's," he said, touching the flower with infinite gentleness. "My wife's." Martha remained silent, sensing the weight of this moment. Luis had never spoken much about his wife before, carrying his grief like a private burden. "She loved these flowers," he continued, his voice low and measured. "Said they were like little dancers in the wind. She'd point them out whenever we went walking." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Folk in town, they weren't always kind to her. She was built strong, like you, able to work as hard as any man. But some people, they only saw her size, made cruel jokes." Martha's hands twisted in her apron, understanding too well. Catalina had set aside her sketching, listening intently. "But Maria," Luis's voice warmed with the memory, "she never let their words steal her joy. Every Sunday, rain or shine, she'd put on her best dress and sing in church. Had the voice of an angel, she did. Didn't matter who stared or whispered. She'd just close her eyes and lift up her voice, pure and clear as mountain spring water." He carefully closed the Bible, but kept his hand resting on its worn cover. "Lost her in childbed 7 years ago. The baby too. After that, I couldn't bear to hear the singing anymore. Came up here to the mountain, where the only music was wind in the pines." Martha's eyes filled with tears. She thought of all the times she'd caught herself starting to hum, only to fall silent, ashamed of drawing attention. How many times had she and Catalina been mocked for their size, their plain faces? Yet here was Luis, telling them of a woman who had refused to let cruelty dim her light. Almost without thinking, Martha began to hum softly, an old hymn their mother had taught them, about grace and morning light. The melody filled the cabin's morning quiet, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Luis stood very still, his eyes closed. Then, surprising them all, his deep voice joined in, rough but true, The harmony wrapped around Martha's melody like a warm embrace. When the last note faded, there were tears on his weathered cheeks, but he was smiling. "Been too long since these walls heard singing," he said gruffly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. After that morning, something shifted in their little family. Music returned to the cabin like a long-lost friend. Martha would hum while she worked, her voice growing more confident each day. Sometimes Luis would join in, and occasionally even Catalina would add her sweet, shy soprano. As the snow continued to melt, Luis took Martha to a south-facing slope where the earth was already softening. "Good spot for potatoes," he said, testing the soil with his hands. "Maria and I used to plant them here. Early ones might make it if we're lucky." Together they worked the earth, Luis's strength breaking the ground, while Martha's careful hands planted the seed potatoes. The sun warmed their backs as they worked, and Luis shared stories of past gardens, of Maria's clever ways of keeping deer from the vegetables. "She sounds wonderful," Martha said softly, patting soil over another potato. "She would have liked you both," Luis replied, his voice gentle. "She always said the mountain needed more kind hearts." Nearby, Catalina had found her own spot by the creek that ran past their potato patch. She sat on a sun-warmed rock, her sketchbook open on her lap. Spring birds had returned to the mountain bluebirds and juncos flitting among the bare branches, red-winged blackbirds calling from the willows. Her pencil moved swiftly, capturing their movements in quick, sure strokes. She had filled pages with drawings of their mountain home over the winter, but these spring sketches held a new energy, a sense of awakening and promise. Luis paused in his digging to watch her work. "You've got a gift there," he said. "Maria tried to draw, but she said the birds never would sit still long enough." He chuckled at the memory, the sound comfortable and warm in the spring air. Martha looked around at their little patch of mountain, the cabin sending up wisps of wood smoke, the creek singing over rocks, the patches of earth they'd just planted. For the first time, she felt no tension in her shoulders, no need to make herself smaller or less noticeable. This place, these people, they had become home in a way she'd never thought to find again after their parents died. The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Luis and Martha finished planting the potatoes while Catalina filled page after page with birds and budding branches. The air grew cooler as the sun began to sink, painting the snow-capped peaks in rose and gold. "Supper time," Martha called, brushing dirt from her skirts. She had stew simmering back at the cabin, and the bread she'd started that morning would be ready. As they walked back together, Luis began humming one of Maria's favorite hymns. Martha joined in, then Catalina, their voices blending with the creek's song and the evening bird calls. The mountain seemed to cradle their music, sending it up toward the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, the familiar sense of home welcomed them. Fresh bread, simmering stew, wood smoke, and the lingering sweetness of pine. Luis's Bible lay on the table where he'd left it that morning, the pressed columbine safely preserved between its pages. But its presence no longer felt like a secret weight of grief. Instead, it was a bridge between past and present, between loss and healing. Martha set about serving supper while Catalina showed Luis her day's sketches. The cabin filled with the soft sounds of family, bowls and spoons clinking, quiet conversation, occasional laughter. Through the windows, they could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the mountain evening. When Martha began humming as she worked, her voice strong and clear, no one was surprised. The melody rose and fell like a gentle tide, carrying with it memories of Maria's courage, of Luis's kindness, of the strength they'd found together. On this mountain they had all found not just shelter, but the freedom to be fully themselves, to sing without shame, to create beauty, to love without fear of mockery. The mountain had become more than a refuge. It had become home. The spring morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight painting the cabin's rough-hewn walls with golden stripes. Martha stood at the iron stove, stirring a pot of beans while cornbread baked. The familiar scent of coffee filled the small space, strong and welcoming. Outside, Luis's axe rang steady against wood, the rhythm as regular as a heartbeat. The dog scout's sudden bark drew everyone's attention. Two figures on horseback emerged from the tree line, their approach slow and deliberate. Luis set down his axe and straightened, watching them wind up the narrow trail to the cabin. "Trappers," he said quietly through the open door. "Martha, Catalina, might be best if you stay inside for now." The sisters exchanged glances but nodded, though Martha kept working near the window where she could hear. Catalina settled at the table with her sketchbook, pencil poised but forgotten as she listened. The riders pulled up in the yard, their horses' hooves crunching on the last patches of spring snow. Both men were weather-beaten and trail-worn, their buckskins showing hard use. "Morning, Red," the older one called out, touching the brim of his battered hat. "Smelled your coffee from half a mile down. Reckon you might spare a cup for tired travelers?" Luis's face remained carefully neutral. "Coffee's hot. Step down if you've a mind to." The trappers dismounted, introducing themselves as Jake Wheeler and Tom Boone. They'd been working their lines up in the high country, they explained, and were headed back to town to trade their furs. Inside the cabin, Martha set out tin cups and poured the coffee, her movements precise and controlled. When Luis led the men inside, she nodded politely but kept her distance, moving to stand near her sister. The trappers settled their lanky frames onto the bench, looking around with poorly concealed curiosity. Wheeler took a long drink of coffee, then cleared his throat. "Mighty fine coffee, ma'am," he said to Martha. "Been a while since we had the pleasure of a lady's cooking." His tone was careful, almost too careful. Luis sat in his chair by the hearth, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. "You men been long on the trail?" 3 weeks, Boone answered. "Long enough to hear some interesting talk down in Elk Creek." He paused, glancing between the sisters. "Folk there seem mighty concerned about your situation up here." Martha's hands clenched in her apron. Catalina's pencil scratched against paper, her head bowed low. "That so?" Luis's voice remained level, but his jaw tightened slightly. Wheeler shifted uncomfortably. "Way they tell it, you've got yourself two—" He hesitated. "Wives up here in the hills. Some folks are taking exception to that notion." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Martha felt her face flame red with shame and anger. Catalina's pencil stopped moving entirely. But Luis didn't move, didn't change expression. He took another sip of coffee, unhurried. "Reckon folks ought to mind their own business," he said quietly. "These ladies are under my protection, nothing more. They're free to go or stay as they please." "No offense meant," Wheeler said quickly. "Just thought you should know what's being said. Mine foreman's been particularly vocal about it. Says it ain't proper." "A man can't change fools," Luis replied, his voice steady as mountain stone. "Only his own heart." The simple dignity in his words seemed to fill the cabin. Martha felt some of her shame dissolve, replaced by a fierce pride in this quiet man who'd given them shelter and respect when others had only offered mockery. The trappers finished their coffee in awkward silence, then made their excuses to leave. At the door, Boone turned back. "No disrespect intended, Red. You've always been square with us trappers, just—" He glanced at the sisters, then back to Luis. "Watch yourself. Some folks down there ain't as understanding as we are." After they'd ridden away, Martha tried to return to her work, but her hands trembled too much to manage the dishes. Tears she'd held back began to fall, splashing on the wooden counter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Luis crossed the room slowly, his limp more pronounced after standing so long. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Now, Martha," he said softly, "don't you carry their foolishness as your burden. God sees truth, even when men are blind to it." Catalina came to stand beside them, her dark eyes worried. "Should we leave? Find somewhere else?" "No," Luis said firmly. "This is your home now if you want it. We're family here, proper as any. Different sort, maybe, but no less real for that." He reached for his worn Bible on the shelf, opening it to where Maria's pressed flower marked the page. "My wife used to say that some folks can only see with their eyes, not their hearts, but God sees deeper. He knows who we truly are." Martha wiped her eyes with her apron. "I just wish," she began, then stopped, unable to express the ache of being judged, yet again, for who she was. "I know," Luis said gently. "Come, let's pray together." It was something they'd never done before. Their prayers had always been separate, private things. But now Luis knelt carefully by his chair, gesturing for them to join him. Martha and Catalina knelt too, forming a small circle in the fading daylight. Luis's prayer was simple but heartfelt. "Lord, you know our hearts. You see the truth of who we are and why we're here. Give us strength to bear others' misunderstanding. Help us remember that your love is bigger than their judgment. And thank you, Lord, for bringing us together as family. Amen." "Amen," Martha and Catalina whispered together, their voices stronger than they expected. As darkness settled over the mountain, coyotes began their eerie chorus in the distance. But inside the cabin, peace held firm. Martha built up the fire while Catalina sketched by lamplight, capturing the moment in her book. 3 figures kneeling together, their heads bowed in prayer. Luis sat in his chair, reading his Bible quietly. Every so often he would look up at the sisters, Martha humming softly as she worked, Catalina lost in her art, and a small smile would touch his weathered face. The coyotes' song rose and fell outside their walls, wild and lonely. But within the cabin, something stronger than loneliness had taken root. Faith had become their shield, turning judgment's sting to strength. What had begun as charity had grown into family, bound not by blood, but by choice and trust and prayer. Martha looked around at their small home, at Luis reading by firelight, at Catalina's bent head, at the dishes she'd washed and dried, at the quilt she'd mended draped over Luis's chair. Every piece of it was real, honest, and true. No amount of gossip or judgment could change that. The mountain night deepened outside, stars appearing one by one above the pines. Inside, the lamp burned steady, casting warm light over their faces as they sat together, at peace in the knowledge that God saw their hearts and knew their truth. The late spring sun warmed the mountain air as Luis stood in the yard, studying the cabin's weather-worn roof. Patches of new green dotted the surrounding pines, and songbirds called from the branches. Martha and Catalina emerged from the cabin, carrying tools and supplies they'd gathered for the day's work. "Reckon it's time we fixed those loose shingles," Luis said, pointing up at the roof's peak. "Winter did its share of damage." Martha shaded her eyes, assessing the task. "Those boards near the chimney look mighty worn, too." "Indeed they do." Luis tested the wooden ladder against the cabin wall. "Let's get to it then." They worked together with the easy rhythm they'd developed over the months. Luis climbed up first, his limp less pronounced these days, though he still moved carefully. Martha passed him boards and nails while Catalina organized tools on the ground. The morning wore on as they replaced damaged shingles and reinforced weak spots. Luis's hammering echoed through the trees, though not always in the steadiest pattern. After one particularly crooked nail, Martha couldn't help herself. "Luis Red," she called up, trying to keep a straight face. "I do believe that nail's dancing a jig up there." Catalina giggled, pointing at the zigzagging line of nails. "It looks like Scout's been helping you hammer." Luis's weathered face creased in mock offense. "Now see here, ladies," he grumbled, though his eyes twinkled. "I'd like to see either of you do better while perched up here like a mountain goat." "Oh, we wouldn't dare try," Martha teased. "Your crooked nails have quite the artistic merit to them." Luis pretended to sulk, but his shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. "Keep that up, and I might just leave a few holes for you to enjoy come next rainfall." The sisters exchanged gleeful looks. It felt good to tease him, to be comfortable enough to joke with this quiet man who'd become so dear to them. Luis's gruff exterior had long since softened into familial warmth, and days like this showed how far they'd come from that cold winter night at the auction. By midday, the roof was sound again. They moved on to the hearth, which needed a thorough cleaning after months of constant use. Martha mixed sand and water to scrub the stones, while Catalina swept away old ashes. Luis cleaned the chimney, sending cascades of soot down that had them all coughing and laughing. "You look like a coal miner," Catalina exclaimed when Luis emerged, his face streaked black. "And you're not much better," he retorted, gesturing to the smudges on their own faces. Martha wet a cloth and reached up to wipe Luis's cheek, the gesture natural and daughterly. He stood still, allowing it with a gentle smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. As afternoon settled into evening, Martha began preparing their feast. She'd been saving special ingredients for days. Wild onions she'd gathered, dried herbs from Luis's wife's garden, and the rabbits Luis had trapped yesterday. The cabin filled with savory aromas as she stirred the thick stew. Catalina set their rough-hewn table with care, using the good tin plates and even placing a small vase of early wildflowers in the center. Luis sat in his chair, whittling a new spoon and watching them with quiet contentment. The stew bubbled in the freshly cleaned hearth, rich with tender meat and vegetables. When Martha finally declared it ready, they gathered around the table, heads bowed as Luis offered thanks. "Lord, we're grateful for this food, for this day of work together, and for the blessing of family found instead of born. Amen." "Amen," the sisters echoed, their voices strong and sure. They ate with healthy appetite, sharing bread and stew while talking about their day's accomplishments. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. Martha found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, her usual self-consciousness forgotten in the warmth of their companionship. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Luis brought out his old guitar. The instrument had belonged to his wife, and he'd only recently begun playing it again. His fingers moved slowly over the strings, picking out the familiar tune of Blessed Assurance. Catalina started singing first, her clear voice rising sweet and true. Martha joined in, harmony coming naturally to her deep alto. Even Luis added his rough baritone, creating a blend that filled the cabin with joy. Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine, oh, what a foretaste of glory, divine heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of his Spirit, washed in his blood. The hymn's words seemed to embrace them, wrapping around their shoulders like a warm shawl. When they reached the chorus, Martha felt something break free inside her, a barrier she'd built long ago against the world's cruelty. She threw her head back and laughed, pure and loud, the sound ringing off the cabin walls like bells. Luis and Catalina stopped singing, startled by the unexpected burst of joy. Then they too began laughing, the music forgotten as they gave themselves over to simple happiness. Catalina reached for her sketchbook, Luis's wife's old one, now filled with new memories. Her pencil moved swiftly across the paper, capturing the scene. Luis with his guitar, eyes crinkled in mirth. Martha with her head thrown back in laughter, face alight with joy. The hearth glowing behind them, the cleaned stones reflecting the firelight. Luis set aside his guitar and moved to look over Catalina's shoulder. His expression softened as he watched the sketch take shape. "You've got a gift, girl," he said quietly. "You see right into the heart of things." Catalina blushed at the praise, but kept drawing, adding details that spoke of their day together. The tools still scattered by the door, Martha's cooking pots hanging clean on their hooks. Wildflowers on the table. The fire crackled warmly as evening deepened into night. Luis settled back in his chair, watching his found family with eyes that shone with gratitude. "Lord," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion, "I thank you for this day, for work done together, for laughter shared, for company finer than gold." He paused, swallowing hard. "For making something new and precious from what was broken." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at his words. She reached over and squeezed his hand, while Catalina leaned against his chair, her head resting against his shoulder. Together they watched the fire dance, 3 hearts beating in harmony, 3 souls bound by something stronger than blood. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dark, its song pure and sweet. Inside the cabin, the last rays of sunset painted everything in soft gold, the scrubbed hearth, the mended roof visible through the window, the faces of this unlikely family brought together by grace and grown strong in love. Catalina's sketch captured it all, not just their faces and the scene around them, but the joy that filled the space between them, the happiness that had transformed their shelter into a true home. She added final touches to the drawing as the light faded, preserving this perfect moment when everything felt right and whole and blessed. The morning after their day of laughter, a cloud of dust rose on the mountain trail. Martha spotted it first from where she hung laundry, shielding her eyes against the bright sun. The rider's approach sent Scout into a flurry of barking, drawing Luis from his workshop, where he'd been mending tools. "Looks official," Martha said quietly, noting the straight-backed posture of the approaching horseman. Her stomach knotted with worry. The rider proved to be young Tommy Wells, the sheriff's deputy, his badge glinting dully against his dust-coated vest. He dismounted stiffly, holding his reins in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. "Mr. Red?" Tommy nodded, trying to sound formal despite his youth. "Got a letter here from Sheriff Greeley. County seal and all." He held out the envelope like it might bite him. Luis wiped his hands on his leather apron before accepting the letter. His weathered fingers traced the red wax seal bearing the county's mark. By now, Catalina had joined them, her sketchbook clutched protectively against her chest. "Much obliged, Tommy," Luis said evenly. "Care for some water before you head back?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir, thank you. Sheriff wants me right back." He mounted quickly, clearly relieved to be leaving. He says he expects you tomorrow, Mr. Red." They watched the dust settle in Tommy's wake before Luis broke the seal. His eyes moved slowly across the page, his expression unchanging. But Martha saw his shoulders tense. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff wants to question me about unlawful custody," Luis replied, folding the letter carefully. Seems some folks in town have raised concerns about our arrangement here. Catalina's face went pale. They can't make us leave, can they? Luis's expression softened as he looked at the sisters. No one's making anyone leave. I'll ride down tomorrow and sort this out proper. We're coming with you, Martha stated firmly, her chin lifting in determination. Martha. No, she cut him off. We started this together. We'll face it together. Besides, she added with a hint of her earlier teasing, who knows what trouble you'd get into without us there to keep you straight? Luis's mouth twitched in a small smile, but his eyes remained serious. It's your choice. But pack warm. Nights are still cold in the valley. They spent the afternoon preparing. Luis pulled his good coat from the trunk where it had lain since winter, brushing off dust and straightening the worn collar. Martha packed bread, dried meat, and apples, while Catalina filled their water skins. Their movements were quiet, weighted with worry. As sunset approached, Luis hitched the wagon, while Martha and Catalina loaded their bedrolls and supplies. Scout circled anxiously, sensing their unease. Stay, boy, Luis commanded softly. Guard the cabin. The dog whined, but sat obediently by the door as they climbed onto the wagon's bench. The trail down the mountain seemed rougher than usual, each bump and rut jarring their already unsettled nerves. The sisters sat close together on one side of Luis, drawing comfort from each other's presence. They passed the time with prayer, their voices barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels. Lord, Martha murmured, guide us through this valley. Your rod and your staff, they comfort us. Amen, Luis and Catalina whispered together. The sun was setting when they finally caught sight of Elk Creek. The town's windows glowed yellow in the gathering dusk, each light seeming to peer at them like suspicious eyes. Martha felt Catalina tremble beside her and reached for her sister's hand. Luis guided the wagon past the silent storefronts. A few townspeople still moved along the boardwalks, their faces turning to watch the small family's passage. Martha held her head high, though her heart pounded against her ribs. They stopped at the small church at the edge of town. Luis had already arranged with Reverend Davies to use the stable behind the building for the night. The minister met them there, his kind face creased with concern. Brother Luis, he greeted them softly. Sisters, there's fresh hay in the loft, and you're welcome to use the church pump for water. Much obliged, Reverend, Luis replied, helping the sisters down from the wagon. We won't be any trouble. You've never been trouble, Luis, the minister said firmly. Remember that tomorrow. With a gentle nod to Martha and Catalina, he walked back to the church, his footsteps fading in the growing dark. They made camp in the stables, loft, spreading their bedrolls on the sweet-smelling hay. Martha built a small fire in the old brazier they'd brought, careful to keep it well away from anything flammable. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls as they shared a quiet supper. Try to sleep, Luis advised as they finished eating. Tomorrow will come soon enough. But sleep proved elusive. Martha lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the town, so different from their peaceful mountain. Somewhere a dog barked, and horses stamped in their stalls below. The church bell tolled 10 o'clock, then 11. She heard Catalina's breathing even out in sleep beside her, but Luis remained awake, sitting against a post near the loft's edge. His profile was outlined against the starlight from the window, steady and strong as always. Luis, she whispered. I'm sorry we brought this trouble on you. He turned to look at her, his expression hidden in shadow. You didn't bring trouble, Martha. The trouble was already here, in people's hearts. Sometimes standing up to it is the only right choice. But what if? No what ifs, he interrupted gently. We'll face tomorrow when it comes. For now, rest. God's still watching, even in town." Martha closed her eyes, letting his words settle over her like a blanket. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, just like the one at home. She held on to that sound, letting it carry her finally into uneasy sleep. Luis remained awake longer, his prayers rising silent but steady into the night. Below in the stable, their horse shifted in its stall, and the brazier's embers glowed like tiny stars fallen to earth. He watched over his sleeping family, this precious gift he'd never expected to receive, and prepared his heart for whatever the morning might bring. The night passed slowly, marked by the regular tolling of the church bell. Each chime seemed to draw them closer to the morning's reckoning, while the lights of Elk Creek flickered through the stable windows like silent witnesses to their vigil. Dawn crept over Elk Creek with hesitant fingers of light. Martha woke to find Luis already up, straightening his collar in the dim stable. His good coat, though worn, had been carefully brushed free of hay. Catalina clutched her precious sketchbook as they made their way to the courthouse, a square brick building that loomed like a mountain of judgment. Already, townsfolk filled the wooden benches inside. Their whispers fell silent as Luis and the sisters entered, then rose again like angry wasps. Martha kept her chin high, though her hands trembled beneath her shawl. They took seats in the front row, where Reverend Davies had saved them places. "The Lord be with you," the minister murmured. Before Luis could respond, Sheriff Greeley's heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison." The judge, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, took his seat, behind the elevated desk. He shuffled papers with precise movements, then peered down at the assembled crowd. "We're here to address allegations concerning Mr. Luis Red and his household arrangements," Judge Harrison stated, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Whitaker, you may present your concerns." The mine foreman rose, his usual swagger emphasized for the crowd's benefit. He wore a new vest, Martha noticed, probably bought with wages held back from his workers. "Your Honor," Whitaker began, his voice oily with false concern. "We've got ourselves a serious moral situation up in them hills. This here Red, he's keeping 2 women, unmarried women, up at his cabin for indecent purposes." He paused, letting the crowd's murmurs swell. "Bought 'em at auction, he did, like they was property. Ain't natural, ain't decent." Laughter rippled through the courthouse. Martha felt her face burn, but beside her, Luis sat straight and calm as a pine tree in winter. "And what evidence do you have of these indecent purposes?" the judge asked. "Well, what other purpose could there be?" Whitaker smirked. "Man living alone with 2 women? Everybody knows his reputation as a hermit. Now he's got himself a private arrangement up there, away from decent folks' eyes." More laughter, crueler now. Martha saw Catalina's fingers tighten around her sketchbook until the knuckles went white. "Miss Hale," the judge called, peering at Martha. "Please approach and tell us your version of events." Martha's legs felt wooden as she walked to the front. She could feel every eye in the room boring into her back. Taking a deep breath, she faced the crowd. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quavering slightly before finding strength. "Mr. Red saved us that night. The auction wasn't proper. Everyone knows that. They were making sport of us. 2 orphan girls with nowhere to go." She swallowed hard. "Mr. Red took us in, gave us shelter from the storm. He's never once acted with anything but perfect decency. He sleeps by the hearth while we take the bed. We pray together, work together. He's taught us to survive in the mountains with honor." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke the truth. "I cook our meals. Catalina tends the garden. Mr. Red repairs tools for farmers and teaches us scripture. That's all. That's the whole truth before God." The crowd's laughter had died, but scattered scoffs and disbelieving mutters remained. Judge Harrison studied Martha's face carefully. "And you've never felt threatened or compromised?" "No, sir. Never. Mr. Red treats us like a father would his daughters." "Miss Catalina Hale," the judge called next. "Do you have anything to add?" Catalina approached, clutching her sketchbook. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I can show you, sir. I've drawn our days." She opened the book with trembling fingers. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles as Catalina turned pages. "Here's Mr. Red teaching me to split. Kindling, and here he is praying by the fire. This one shows him and Martha fixing the barn roof after the big snow. And here," she turned another page, "here we all are reading the Bible after supper." The careful charcoal drawings showed scene after scene of simple, decent life. The details were clear: the worn Bible on the table, the mended curtains, the way Luis sat apart in his chair while the sisters worked at their tasks. Through Catalina's gifted hands, their daily truth was laid bare. Judge Harrison studied the drawings for a long moment. "These are quite skilled, young lady, and quite telling." He looked up at the crowd. "Mr. Red, what do you have to say in your defense?" Luis stood slowly, his bad leg stiff from sitting. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "I'd do it again," he said simply. "Those girls needed help. The good book says true religion is caring for orphans in their distress. That's all I aimed to do." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some looked away, perhaps remembering their own laughter at the auction, but others, led by Whitaker, jeered openly now. "Convenient scripture," someone called out. "Bet you know plenty about distress." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order!" When the room quieted, Judge Harrison removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. "This is a serious matter requiring further investigation. Until we can determine the proper legal and moral standing of this situation, Mr. Red will remain in custody of the sheriff. The young ladies will be housed with Reverend Davies and his wife." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Catalina made a small sound of distress. But Luis's expression never changed. "Your Honor," Reverend Davies stood, "I can attest to Mr. Red's character. I've known him since he came back from the war." "Your testimony will be welcomed at the formal hearing," the judge cut in. "For now, my ruling stands. Court is adjourned until further notice." The gavel fell again with dreadful finality. Sheriff Greeley approached Luis, who stood calmly waiting. "I'm sorry, Luis," the sheriff muttered, not meeting his eyes as he took out his handcuffs. "Got to do this proper." Martha wanted to cry out, to protest, but Luis caught her eye and gave a slight shake of his head. His quiet dignity in the face of this humiliation struck her heart like an arrow. "Trust in the Lord," he said softly as the sheriff led him away. "All will be well." The crowd began to disperse, their excitement fading now that the spectacle was over. Some looked uncomfortable, as if the weight of what they'd witnessed was finally settling on their consciences. But others, like Whitaker, wore smug expressions of satisfaction. Reverend Davies gathered Martha and Catalina gently. "Come along, girls. Sarah has lunch waiting, and you'll have the spare room to yourselves." As they followed him out, Martha glanced back one last time. Through the courthouse window, she could see Luis being led to the jail, his steps steady despite his limp, his head held high. He looked like a man who knew his own heart was true, no matter what others might say. Catalina clutched her sketchbook close, her latest drawing visible, Luis standing before the judge, straight and strong as the mountains themselves. Even in black and white, his quiet moral strength shone from the page like a beacon of truth. They stepped out into the bright spring morning. But the sunshine felt cold now. The courthouse clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the street like a reminder that truth and justice don't always walk the same path, at least not right away. But Luis's words echoed in Martha's heart. Trust in the Lord. All will be well. Shadows lengthened across the courthouse floor as evening approached. The last rays of sunlight slanted through tall windows, painting amber stripes on the wooden benches. Luis sat quietly in his chair, hands folded, while Martha and Catalina waited on the bench behind him. The judge had called a brief recess, but everyone knew the verdict was coming soon. The heavy courthouse doors creaked open. A tall figure in a black coat stood silhouetted against the dying light. Boots clicked on the wooden floor as Reverend Elijah Halverson made his way down the center aisle. His weathered face bore the marks of years riding circuit, bringing the word to scattered homesteads and mining camps. Your Honor, the Reverend's deep voice filled the hushed room. I believe I have testimony relevant to this case. Judge Harrison looked up, adjusting his spectacles. The hour is late, Reverend, but please proceed. The old preacher walked to the front, his eyes finding Luis. Recognition flickered between the two men. I know this man, Reverend Halverson said, turning to face the crowd. Not from these mountains, but from the war. I was chaplain with the 23rd Infantry at Chickamauga. Luis's head lifted slightly, his expression unchanged but alert now. September 18th, 1863, the Reverend continued. The fighting was fierce near Vineyard Field. Artillery fire had our men pinned down in a gully. 12 soldiers, badly wounded, no way to reach the field hospital. He paused, his voice growing thick with memory. That's when I saw Luis Red. Martha leaned forward, her heart pounding. Catalina's pencil moved swiftly across her sketchbook, capturing the scene. This man here, he went out into that fire 6 times. 6 times, carrying those wounded boys 2 at a time on his back. Cannon shells bursting, rebel sharpshooters taking aim, and he just kept going back. Never said a word, just did what needed doing. The Reverend's voice grew stronger. Lost part of his hearing that day from the artillery, but he saved every one of those 12 men. I watched him carry the last 2 as the sun was setting, blood soaking his uniform, but he wouldn't quit until they were all safe. The courthouse was utterly silent now. Even the mine foreman had lost his smug expression. And after the war, Reverend Halverson continued, I've seen him here in these mountains, fixing roofs for widows, building cradles for new mothers, mending tools for farmers who can't afford a proper blacksmith. He turned to face the judge directly. These hands, he gestured to Luis, these hands only build and heal. That's the truth I know of Luis Red. The silence held. Through the windows, a whip-poor-will called out in the gathering dusk. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, removed his spectacles, and slowly wiped them with a handkerchief. Well, he said at last, replacing his spectacles. This puts rather a different light on matters. He straightened in his chair. Having heard all testimony, and considering the evidence presented, including Miss Catalina's rather illuminating sketches, I find no cause for further proceedings. The judge's gavel rose and fell. All charges are hereby dismissed. The record of this hearing will be sealed. He fixed the crowd with a stern look. And I trust there will be no more gossip about this matter in Elk Creek Crossing? Luis stood, seeming almost dazed. Martha and Catalina rushed forward, tears streaming freely down their faces. They embraced him as the courthouse began to empty, people filing out quietly, many looking ashamed. Reverend Halverson approached the small group. Still doing the Lord's work, I see, he said softly to Luis, saving those who need saving. Luis's voice was rough with emotion. Much obliged for speaking up, Reverend. Didn't expect anyone would remember that day. Some things a man doesn't forget, the old preacher replied. God's grace works through many hands, friend, even the quiet ones in the mountains. Through tear-blurred eyes, Martha saw Catalina adding final touches to her sketch. The Reverend standing tall, Luis humble but unbowed, the last sunlight streaming through the windows like heaven's own vindication. The truth had come to light, just as Luis had said it would. The wagon wheels creaked along the muddy mountain trail as Luis guided them home. Soft spring rain pattered against the canvas cover, but inside, warmth radiated from their shared victory. Martha sat close to Catalina, their shoulders touching, while Scout trotted faithfully alongside the wagon. "Look there," Catalina whispered, pointing to where a rainbow arched over the distant peaks. The colors seemed brighter somehow, as if nature itself celebrated their vindication. The cabin came into view just as the afternoon light broke through the clouds. Luis pulled the wagon to a gentle stop, and Martha felt her heart swell at the sight of their home. Their home, the thought no longer carried any shame or uncertainty. "Best get everything inside before the rain picks up again," Luis said, his quiet voice carrying its usual practical warmth. They had barely finished unloading when hoofbeats approached. Martha tensed, but it was only young Tommy from the general store, leading a laden pack mule. "Ma'am?" He nodded respectfully to Martha, then to Catalina. "Pa sent these supplies, said they're long overdue." The boy's ears reddened as he helped them unpack sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and, to their surprise, 3 leather-bound hymnals. "We can't accept," Martha began, but Luis laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We can," he said softly. "Folks need to make things right in their own way." After Tommy left, they spent the afternoon setting their home in order. Luis worked on the creaking porch boards, his hammer's rhythm mixing with the subsiding rain. Inside, Martha and Catalina scrubbed the plank floors until they gleamed. Their laughter echoed through the cabin, no longer restrained by fear or shame. "I've been thinking," Catalina said, sitting back on her heels, her sketch paper spread before her, "about all the other women like us, the ones who get laughed at, pushed aside." Martha paused in her work, wiping her brow. "What about them?" "What if—" Catalina's eyes shone with purpose. "What if we started a school? Not just reading and writing, but a place where women who've been laughed at too long could learn they're worth something?" The idea hung in the air like a prayer. Martha looked to Luis, who had come in for his coffee. He considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Reckon I could build some benches," he said. "Maybe expand the porch for days when weather's fair." Martha felt tears welling up. Not tears of shame this time, but of hope. "You'd do that?" "Already got the lumber seasoning in the barn," Luis replied with a slight smile. "Been waiting for the right purpose." That evening, as they sat around the fire, a rider appeared with a telegram from Reverend Halverson. Martha's hands trembled as she read it aloud. "Dear friends, stop church council approves. School proposal stop will provide books and support. Stop God's work knows no bounds. Stop Halverson." Catalina hugged the telegram to her chest, while Luis bowed his head in quiet thanksgiving. Martha looked around their cabin, at the fresh scrubbed floors, the hymnals on the shelf, the sketches of their daily life that Catalina had lovingly pinned to the walls. Every corner spoke of renewal, of purpose found in the ashes of humiliation. "Reckon we ought to sing something," Luis suggested, reaching for one of the new hymnals. His weather-roughened fingers found the page with careful reverence. Martha's voice rose first, then Catalina's, and finally Luis's deeper tones joined in. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The harmony filled their cabin, spilling out into the rain-washed evening. Scout lay by the hearth, tail thumping contentedly on the clean floors. Through the window, they could see the fresh-cut lumber Louise had stacked, ready to become benches for women who needed to rest their weary souls. The last light of day filtered through the cabins. Windows, touching everything with gold, the scrubbed floors, the steaming coffee cups, the sketches on the walls, and 3 faces alight with shared purpose. Their home was no longer just a shelter from ridicule, but a beacon of hope taking shape in the mountains. Martha looked at her small family, Louise studying the hymnal with quiet concentration, Catalina adding details to her latest sketch of their cabin-turned-schoolhouse. Faith filled every corner, not just in prayers and hymns, but in the solid reality of lumber waiting to be shaped, floors scrubbed clean for new beginnings, and hearts ready to heal others as they had been healed themselves. Snow dusted the mountain peaks like powdered sugar, just as it had 1 year ago. But this winter brought a different kind of warmth to the ridge above Elk Creek. The new schoolhouse, built by Louise's steady hands throughout the summer, stood proudly beside the original cabin. Yellow lamplight spilled from its windows into the gathering dusk, while smoke curled from both chimneys into the pearl-gray sky. Inside the schoolhouse, 8 women and girls bent over primers and slates. Some bore the drawn faces of recent widows, others the uncertain eyes of orphans who'd known too much cruelty. But here, wrapped in the warmth of quilted walls and gentle instruction, their shoulders slowly uncurled like spring flowers. Martha moved between the rough-hewn benches, her strong hands steady as she guided trembling fingers over letters. "That's right, Sarah," she encouraged a young widow. "Sound it out slow, just like we practiced." Near the front, Catalina sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by younger girls. Her sketches brought Bible stories to life. Daniel in the lion's den, David facing Goliath, Moses parting the sea. The drawing spoke hope to those who couldn't yet read the words. "See here," Catalina said, holding up a fresh sketch of Jesus healing the blind man. "Sometimes the greatest miracles look like the smallest kindnesses." The girls leaned in, their eyes wide with wonder. Outside, Louise's axe rang steady against wood. He'd been chopping since dawn, ensuring both buildings stayed warm through the long mountain nights. Scout lounged nearby in the snow, alert for any strange sounds. But these days, visitors brought supplies and support more often than trouble. As evening deepened, Martha rang the small brass bell Louise had salvaged from an abandoned church. The women gathered their shawls and books, heading home to nearby cabins Louise had helped them build over the summer. Their thank yous and God bless yous floated on the crisp air. Inside the original cabin, Martha stirred a pot of venison stew, the same recipe from that first fearful night, now seasoned with confidence and joy. The table where they'd first sat as strangers now bore the marks of countless shared meals and prayers. Louise stamped snow from his boots and settled into his chair, watching as Catalina arranged her drawings for the next day's lessons. Martha ladled stew into the same tin bowls they'd used that first evening, when trust was as thin as winter sunlight. After supper, Martha opened the worn Bible Louise had once shown them, the one with his wife's pressed flower still marking the Psalms. Her clear voice filled the cabin. "The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Louise bowed his head, his gruff voice softened by gratitude. "Lord," he prayed, "thank you for the laughter that healed a mountain." His words hung in the warm air like a benediction. Through the window, snow drifted silently in the gathering dark, just as it had the night they'd first climbed this mountain together. But now each flake seemed to carry a promise fulfilled. Each moment held the weight of grace. Scout dozed by the hearth, twitching in dreams. The cabin creaked gently, holding its family close. On the walls, Catalina's sketches told their story. 3 lonely souls transformed by mercy into a family, a refuge becoming a beacon. Mockery turned to ministry. Outside, the mountain stood silent under its blanket of snow, bearing witness to the miracle of love's patient work. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.